Thank you all for joining us today. Many of you know my name is Christy Wells. I have the honor of being the CEO of Safe House Project. And we are excited to bring this webinar to you today. This is a difficult time for fundraising, but we're also in fourth quarter. And so I know you guys are all working super hard with events and everything else to bring in those funds to continue the amazing work that you do. But we wanted to bring on our partners with the Wolf Group and Bill Wolf and his team to make sure that you guys know additional information that is out there and make sure you know the resources that they have and that they can be to you. So I will go ahead and get this turned over to Bill and Anthony for them to guide us through today's conversation.
Awesome. Thank you, Christy. Thank you to Safe House. It's such an honor to really partner with you all in this space and really doing some good. It's amazing seeing everyone in here. I want to just thank you all for taking the time and introduce to you a member of our team here at TWG, Anthony Capisi, who is a social impact specialist and just quite honestly an all-around amazing guy, super knowledgeable on the grant space, an incredible writer. And we're really working with some amazing nonprofits to help them build up their grant funding programs. And Safe House Project asked us to come and just share with you some opportunities specific around ARPA funding, because a lot of people just don't know what that is or how to access it. And I'm going to turn it over to the real expert, to Anthony, to share with you all. And we'll be here to answer any questions that you have and support you in any way that we can.
Thank you both for the really kind words and introductions. Really a pleasure to be here. Hi, everyone. My name is Anthony Capisi. Bill said I'm one of the support specialists here at the social impact team at the Wolf Group. And I'm about to share my screen and we're going to talk about ARPA funding. Like Christy said, just to preview this conversation, we're hearing from some of the folks that we work with as well that private philanthropic dollars might be slowing down at some point in the next 18 to 24 months. Typically, there's a little bit of delay from when those foundations start to feel a little bit of an economic crunch to when those trickle down to funding opportunities to the folks that they support. Identifying institutional government funding like ARPA is a great way to maybe safeguard against some shortfalls, either in the future, maybe some of the shortfalls you've already felt as there's donor fatigue as we get further and further into the pandemic. And yeah, just a creative way to think about sustaining your programming, maybe go in new directions and just provide some sustainability future forward. So ARPA funds, the funding that we're talking about is a very specific part of the American Rescue Plan Act that was finalized in January of 22. Specifically, the program is Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Funds. Essentially, this is $350 billion of broad relief to go toward, of course, public health initiatives, but also some of the dynamics that were made worse by the pandemic. Things around economic development, public services that might have been altered or shut down, thinking about places like shelters, soup kitchens that couldn't have guests come in and had to change their operations, and generally investments that support long-term growth and opportunity, addressing some of the dynamics we saw during the pandemic and where your agencies are looking future forward. One thing to note is that there is a lot of variability on where these funds will be allocated locally. This is a federal program, and then states have a lot of authority into what they build into their budget. As we'll talk about further in the presentation, it's really important that you have your finger on the pulse locally in your states, maybe checking in with some of your contacts in local government, and start to get your head around what the opportunity might be in terms of dollars and specific programming that your region or state are trying to support with these funds. So looking at some of these numbers, so far 327 local governments have earmarked $33.5 billion for thousands of projects. So far, about half of that funding has been budgeted so far. And we have some broad-based breakdowns as to where this funding typically goes in budgets. And you'll see we highlighted the first 5 metrics that are really more of these direct services. So generic community aid, community assistance programming, housing, economic development, public health, public safety, and just really trying to build up services that might have been impacted by the pandemic or there's a need that's been identified future forward. So looking at how the Treasury directs funding, again, there are specifics with each locality, each state with how this funding might be directed. But as you can see here, you do have a wide lane on how you can use this funding. First and foremost, you can use this funding to fill in any budget shortfalls that might have occurred in the last couple of years since the start of the pandemic, specifically public sector revenue as things shut down and got adjusted. And also just a lot of space to describe your programming and some of the dynamics that you've seen from the pandemic. A lot of our clients are in the anti-human trafficking space, and we know that a lot of the social distancing policies that were put in place for public health did lead to some situations where folks weren't checked in the same way across the board, which left more room for folks to be exploited and people to be put in harm's way without some of the safeguards that typically would have been in place. It's really a part of how you frame this project, really backing up what your program is addressing and why specifically the pandemic made that issue worse and why your program is necessary. Additionally, you can provide pay for essential workers. To use the example of a soup kitchen, if let's say that your soup kitchen manager had to work overtime for weeks when the pandemic first rolled out, you can use these funds to go back and get that overtime paid, and any other kind of essential workers that were put on the front lines during the pandemic. This can be a way for you to cover some of those additional expenses that you might have incurred during that period. And then finally, this might not be relevant to a bunch of you on the call, but any kind of broad investments to infrastructure, those, as you saw in the previous slide, there's a lot of funding that's going toward those kind of programs, both in terms of in government administration, but also the implementation of these infrastructure projects. So looking at your specific jurisdictions. So like I said, different regions will have ARPA funds within different jurisdictions, different departments. I'm coming in from New Jersey today. So for us in our state, some of those funds are nestled under the state police department. Some of those funds are nestled under our FEMA Emergency Food and Shelter Program, local recipient organization that increased the amount of aid they have to give out. So it's worth reaching out, even just Googling ARPA funding, putting in your state capital, and typically you'll see some news stories, even some legislative briefs, orders that are put out from your local government. That'll give you a sense on where the direction is heading, where these funds are going, and maybe how you can capitalize on that momentum in those projects. We also included a link here to the Brookings Institution. They're tracking how local governments are spending these funds, how they're allocating them. So this can be a great way to do some homework before you dive in, see what's been put out there, and then try to find projects that align with where that funding has been given in the past. So this is a government program, federal dollars administered through state government. So there is some administrative pieces that you will need to have in place. Really just making the case clear that this program is addressing a need that's grown through the coronavirus pandemic, a need that aligns with those broad-based categories that we had a couple of slides ago from the Treasury and how these funds can be used, and really identifying that public service, that intervention, making the case that you're going to be impacting the folks in that region that you're working in specifically. There are some timeline dates on this slide. Really importantly, these are costs that you can track going back to March 3rd of 2021. And most of these costs must be expended by the end of 2026, but must be committed or obligated by end of next year. Again, these are some general guidelines. Individual localities might have a little bit of a different flavor to that. But these are some of the broad-based, just the broad guidelines that we've seen and looking around prepping for this call. They're going to ask for some administrative documents, making sure that you have strong human resources components in place with EEO policies, ADA policies, and just ensuring that your organization is in good fiscal standing so the government feels comfortable giving funds to your program. How do you know if you're ready to apply? So this is a government grant, so you really need to be able to discuss your impact, both what you've done in the recent past, but also showing that you have the data mechanisms, the tracking mechanisms to accurately project how you're going to use those funds, how many folks you're going to, broad costs associated with that, really making sure that you have up-to-date fiscal reports, you have a solid budget justification, just giving the reviewer, giving the government a real sense of confidence that you've really identified the scope of this project, the costs involved, and you are proposing a project with these funds that'll make a tangible impact on the folks that you're trying to serve. Additionally, it's always great to have the feather in your cap of history of your organization managing federal or state dollars. That usually comes with a lot of requirements like providing your financial policies in terms of procurement, accountability, and just general management. things like your board lists, 501c3 certification, administrative documents that we all have in our agencies, and just making sure you have those ready to go and can show the reviewer that your organization is well structured, it's sustainable, and it is a good recipient of these funds and will put them to good use. 5 things to really think about as you get your heads around this application and hopefully ultimately submit one is really importantly, clear, trackable data. You want folks to know what you've done, what you're doing now, and where you're going future forward, and really making that case that this extra investment through state dollars is going to give you the extra capacity to maybe improve or expand programming that's already existing and in need for your community. You're going to want a tangible ask with detailed budget justifications. They're really breaking down, cost per client, cost for staff members, supplies, making sure that you're highlighting direct expenses that'll make a clear impact to the program that you're proposing. Just proofing and making sure that all elements of your narrative, your budget, your outputs are aligned. You always, as a reviewer, it's always weird when you read about this narrative that's doing all these different things, like addressing all these different programs, but then when you go to their budget, they have maybe 1.5 folks full-time equivalent doing all this work. Really make sure that you're staffing appropriately, that you're giving a reasonable scope onto the costs. Some of these applications can be hundreds of thousands of dollars. This isn't the time to try to skimp, be forthright with your costs, justify them, have documentation behind that, and that is one of the most important ingredients to a successful proposal. And then you want to tie this to the action on the ground locally. You want to do your homework reaching out to local government folks. You want to look into strategic plans, either at a regional level, at a state level, and even call out specific language in legislative orders. Just really show the government that, this program really aligns. You're calling out the specific spaces that it really strongly aligns with the intent, the spirit of these dollars, and just tie it back in and make sure it's a really strong takeaway. And finally, look, there are some really interesting funders out there. We've seen funders that accept 5-minute selfie videos to fund organizations and their work. This is not the time to get creative. Government grants are about following the guidelines, answering things specifically. There is an accountability component to government applications, and you really want to make sure that you're answering everything that they're asking for, because there is the chance that folks could look at these applications and they really want to make sure that this funding is going to the right place and has thought through everything that the state is requiring of you. So just when you break down the guidelines, making sure that you're answering all those questions and just even writing it down question by question I've seen before. It's a great way to streamline the process and make sure that the reviewer knows exactly what you're doing. Finally, I'm just going to talk a little bit about Wolf in general. So a little bit about what we do. Like Bill said, we're working with a number of clients, a lot in the anti-trafficking space, but we're also working with folks who do international public health projects. They are doing some really cool gender equity work abroad. We're working on education initiatives and just generally really great people like the Safe House Project doing amazing work in their fields and trying to amplify their impact. A lot of folks come to us looking for funding because we all need that in the nonprofit space. But what I really like in the social impact team is that grant applications are almost like mini strategic plans. You are assessing what you've done, you're assessing the opportunity at hand, and you're trying to project future forward a year, 2 years, sometimes even further than that. There's a lot of administrative documents that go into grant writing, as I'm sure some of our grant writers know on the call. And it's a really great way to get your fingers on the pulse of an agency and maybe project where they're going forward. All of our clients are different, big and small. We try to meet them where they're at, think about what they might need specifically just to make their programs shine, be well positioned for the future, and ultimately make an impact in the communities that they serve. Before we kick it over to questions, we can share out this presentation for you all to take a look at after this call. We have some links here that I referenced in the presentation, namely the Department of Treasury guidance on how to use these funds and some guidance on how local governments are using that. I linked that Brookings Institution resource that looks at local funds and how they're using it. I highly recommend you use that to see what's going on at a state level. And then finally, I linked the Wolf Group site if you all want to check it out and reach out if you need any help. So I'm going to start with Heather's question. That's not how all the funds have to be framed and used. I would say the essential workers, that was more in the early stages of the pandemic where there were a lot more of the stay-at-home orders in place. And if you specifically had frontline workers that had to come in, they didn't have the opportunity to work remotely. If you had issues like filling that staffing, you had to pay people more. This is the way for you to go back and get that back pay. There's a lot of agencies that gave those kind of bonuses, that gave a lot of overtime just to get over the hump. This is a way for you to try to get those dollars back and just make your agency whole again. I think, though, with current programs that you're framing to address needs that arose through the pandemic, I don't think you need to frame them as essential outside of what they're doing in terms of direct programming and how that direct programming is addressing needs that got brought up through the pandemic. Lydia asked about ARPA funding was already awarded in June 2022. Do you expect any other funds that would be released, or have you missed that window? Bill, we were talking yesterday about the second round of funding that states are applying for. Would you maybe mind filling in the blanks there a little bit?
Yeah, so a lot of the states have not been able to expend all of the funds, which is one of the reasons why we really are thankful for this opportunity to share that with you all. We can continue to monitor that, or I would encourage you all to monitor that as well. If a funding cycle is already passed, it's probably going to depend on how much of the money they're able to give out. If they don't have application, or if they didn't spend all the money, then there will be most likely another round until all of that gets out. So I don't have a definitive answer there other than to say, let's keep watching, in particular in California, but also make sure you're checking, I think Anthony mentioned this, make sure you're checking the state, but you're also checking your local jurisdiction as well. So whether it's a county or a town or a city, that you're making sure that you're looking at opportunities there, because different states are allocating money different ways.
On that too, Bill, I see a question from an anonymous attendee about ERC funds on the employee retention credit. I don't think that's part of this program, but would you happen to know that with any more certainty?
So ERC it's a little bit different. It's not a grant program. It's actually a tax credit that you can apply for. We're not super well versed in that just because it's not like I said, it's not a grant program. It's more of a tax credit that you would get back from the IRS. And that application process is I don't want to use the word quite a bit different because that sounds like overly burdensome. It's just a grant is about writing a narrative to support a program. ERC is more focused around just giving you money back for keeping employees on during the pandemic. So it's a different process.
Thanks for that, Bill. Kim asked, they work in the human trafficking space. Do we have suggestions on directions to think about how they connect to ARPA funds? Yeah, I think depending on where you're working with folks, you can put in funding for things like housing. We worked on an application with a client to think about the wraparound services in a transitional shelter that they put together for some of the victims that they work with in the anti-trafficking space. So putting in funding for the social workers, the case managers, even some of the medical professionals that are part of this overall consortium of care that they're trying to build locally and just populate with professionals to provide care to their folks. And like I said, a lot of the case that we built was around just the period of the pandemic leading to just less attention being paid to some of the victims that they were working with and allowing a greater degree of exploitation that they had seen prior to the pandemic. We have an anonymous question. Would there be any restrictions on this funding relative to inclusion or religious freedom issues? I'd like maybe a little bit more clarity on that. Are you saying that you're specifically working with targeted demographics and excluding others? I think at first glance, you want to try to make the case that this is as open and inclusive to everyone in the region as possible. So I don't want to say like a blanket, no, there's no restrictions, but I would say that in terms of how they judge your application, I think they would be more inclined to go with organizations that have more of an open kind of policy in serving folks. But definitely add more specific. If you want to add more specifics, I'm happy to try to address them. With the funding opportunities my state may have available from your presentation, those would qualify as federal funding under the Single Audit Act, correct? Or would they be state funding since they're administered locally?
So technically you're a sub-grantee. So it's very similar. If any of you are VOCA recipients, it's very similar to the way that process works.
And then Heather asked, is there a website where we can see who has received these funds to date in our state and region, and to see if we are in alignment? I'm pretty sure that Brookings Institution link that I dropped does go into that level of specificity. Let me just quickly check.
Also, throughout while you're looking that up, Anthony, a lot of jurisdictions, talking about the alignment piece, a lot of jurisdictions have published strategic plans or action recovery plans from COVID-19 that highlight what some of those priorities are for whether it's at state, county, city, town, whatever. That's another place to kind of double check and look to see if you're in alignment with those priorities.
Thank you for that, Bill. I just did a quick scan and it depends on the municipality or county that put it in. So I'm looking at one from Florida that actually broke down how they allocated every single dollar, and then other ones that are just like support a vaccine clinic with supplies. So it does vary depending on the locality, but no, this is a great place to look to start. You'll get a sense of at least the general ballpark that local legislators have been moving in to allocate these funds. And did you address that question on VOCA with your last response?
Feel free, for those that aren't familiar with VOCA or any of that stuff, feel free to reach out and send us an email and we can kind of share some additional information to dive in a little bit deeper on that. And then that last question, are you finding that you have to educate local, county, state decision makers that victim services an appropriate cost priority to cover with ARPA? So that's a great question, Darlene. A lot of what we've been finding in some of the conversations that we had is we're tying it to what we are seeing is the mental health component. So a lot of jurisdictions are certainly recognizing the need for mental health. And so tying victim services to mental health has been the path of least resistance, I think, when it comes to ARPA funds. But as I know all too well, educating decision makers on victim services is critically important, and making sure that they're aware of why that's a good use of funds, why we need to allocate those funds appropriately. So yes, but we can use the grant narrative to do some of that education as long as we can tie it to one of those priority areas.
Absolutely. And I would just add to that, Darlene, this into just the overarching social safety net that you have locally. You're trying to get folks who could use different pieces of public assistance into care. And I think just that into just what you're seeing, who you're going to be working with, and just the overall strategic plan of where you're proposing your project. Those are ways to frame anti-trafficking victim services in the broader scope of things.
So somebody asked, where do you actually apply? So that's the complicated part. And one of the reasons why we wanted to raise this is because it's not like federal grants where you can go to grants.gov and just research this stuff, right? Depending on your jurisdiction in your state, a lot of it's going to be a little bit of a Google search. So we can, if you send us an email, we're happy to just take some time and just do that just initial research for you to see where you would apply and if they're currently accepting applications.
And then Beth asked, doing the math, looks like there's still potentially 300 billion unspent. I get the sense, Bill, that this is really up to the states. Like they have to really specifically go out and apply for this funding for it to be allocated. Is that generally it, or is there another place that 300 billion is going?
Yeah, so it generally is going out to the states and to localities. There is a formula. It's on that treasury.gov website for how much money is going where. I don't know what the current expenditures are, but I will say that they're really struggling to get the money out the door, which is crazy, right? Like everyone needs money, but a lot of it is because of a lack of awareness around the opportunity and because they're not being well published. They don't know. Organizations like you all are not proactively looking for it, which is why we wanted to raise awareness around this. I will say success rates around applications are fairly high just because they are looking to get the money out. There was one organization that we helped recently that had no background in grants, had no grant funding whatsoever. They submitted just a very basic request and it was just 25,000 like that. Some are much higher. I know others even have floors now. There's one ARPA opportunity out there right now that the floor is 250,000 just because they're trying to move the money out the door. It's an option to consider for your funding needs right now within your organization. And I think that takes us to time. Just wanted to thank you all for taking the time in the middle of the day to join us. We are here to help. Please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Anthony. We have two other members of the social impact team, Catherine and Anna. They're both out today. And then we also have a support specialist, Cindy. So we're here to help you all. If you want to talk more about ARPA or want to explore other grant opportunities, need support in building out your funding, your diversified revenue streams, we are here to help. So thank you all and hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.